Good evening. This is the fourth class in a series on the laws of Shabbat. Today we are continuing with our topic of what are you allowed to say to a non-Jew on Shabbat and what you're not allowed to. What can you ask him directly? What can you hint to him? And what you cannot say at all? And what things he cannot do for you even by himself, even if you don't ask him. And what happens if he does do work for you? Are you allowed to benefit from it? To remind you of a few leniencies that we said last week, that a non-Jew is allowed to do work if it is for a public mitzvah. For example, a family is about to sit to eat their meal and the lights go out. Since eating meal on Shabbat is a mitzvah and there are few people involved, so it's a public mitzvah, you're allowed to ask a non-Jew directly to turn the light on, to press the brake switch, to replace a light bulb. Similarly, in a synagogue, when you have a hot day and the air conditioner was not turned on and people are suffering and they will not be able to pray in the synagogue, you can ask a non-Jew to turn the air conditioner on or to turn the lights on. Another leniency is if it is dangerous for health. If you have a sick person who is lightly ill, you can ask a non-Jew to do work for him. For example, you can ask a non-Jew to go to a pharmacy and get a medicine. Since going to the pharmacy and buying medicine is only rabbinically forbidden, since the non-Jew can walk, and handling money and buying the merchandise is only rabbinically forbidden, you can ask a non-Jew to get medicine for a person who is slightly ill, who has a little bit headache, who is not feeling 100%, but he can function normally. However, if a person is bedridden, or his whole body hurts, or he has a headache that he cannot function normally, he's considered more seriously sick, and you can ask a non-Jew even to do a Torah prohibition. For example, you can ask him directly to turn on an electric appliance, a heater, air conditioner, light, and so on. And by the way, if there is an individual who is so ill that there is danger to his life, then not only you can ask a non-Jew, even a Jew is required to do work on Shabbat to save the life of a Jew. So if you or your family member, or even in a synagogue, a stranger is sick to the point that his life is in danger, don't call a non-Jew, don't call anyone else. You yourself go and do whatever necessary to save his life. However, when there is no danger to life, you can ask a non-Jew, again, if it's slightly sick individual, to do any rabbinic prohibition, and if it's a seriously sick individual, you can ask him to do even Torah prohibition. Another example of a rabbinic prohibition is moving muktzeh. For example, if there is a candle burning and this individual is trying to fall asleep and the light of the candle bothers him, turning the candle off, putting the fire out, is a Torah prohibition. However, just moving it is a rabbinic prohibition called muktzeh. And therefore, if you have an individual who has a cold, he would like to rest, you can ask a non-Jew to take the candles and move them out. However, under normal circumstances, candles that are burning are muktzeh, and even if they go out, there is still muktzeh, and even moving candles that are already out, you cannot until the end of Shabbat. Another leniency we mentioned last week is that the first 13 minutes of Shabbat considered Ben Hashmashot period, twilight period, and at that time you're allowed to ask a non-Jew directly to do whatever you need for Shabbat. If you forgot to turn the light on or off, to turn off the oven or stove, you can quickly go to your neighbor within the first 13 minutes after sunset and ask them directly. Now, today we're going to learn a few new leniencies about this law, and that is the first one. It is permitted to ask a non-Jew to do a rabbinic prohibition to prevent financial loss. In order to save an object from being destroyed, you're allowed to ask a non-Jew to do a rabbinic prohibition. A rabbinic prohibition, an example is moving muktzeh. For example, a candle is dangerously close to something flammable or to something plastic, and you're worried that the heat from the candle will damage the plastic or will catch fire. You can ask a non-Jew to move the candles. Again, to prevent a financial loss, you're allowed to ask a non-Jew to do a rabbinic prohibition. Now, once we mention fire, what are the laws of putting out fire on Shabbat? Just like we're not allowed to turn on the fire on Shabbat, we're not allowed to put out fire on Shabbat. However, what happens if fire catches on to tablecloth or to a piece of furniture? Chas v'shalom. Are you allowed to put out the fire? So it used to be when houses were made from stone and when there were no trees around the house, the law was that if it's dangerous for life of people that are in the house, you can put out the fire. And if it's not dangerous, if people can get out safely, then you just walk out of the house, you grab your most necessary things for Shabbat, like food and basic clothing, and you leave the house. However, nowadays, since many houses are built from wood, and even houses that are brick, but since there are trees around, and especially for an apartment building, since the fire can spread to another apartment, even if in your house or in your apartment everyone can leave safely, but you don't know, maybe there is a sick or an elderly in another apartment who will not be able to run away, or maybe the fire will spread so fast, so far, that it will cause danger to life. And therefore, since we live in cities and even in rural areas, since there are trees around, fire can spread. And therefore, we are allowed to turn off, to put out any fire that develops in our house. Unless you are absolutely sure that it's safe, if you can put around the fire bottles of water so that in case the fire spreads, the water bottles will burst and put out the fire. If you're absolutely sure that no damage is going to be done, then you can let it burn. However, if there is even slight chance that the fire can get out of control and cause danger to human life, you can put it out. However, there is one rule you need to know, and that is whenever you can decrease the sin, you should do that. For example, putting out the fire may be a Torah prohibition. However, we said that moving fire is only rabbinic prohibition. So therefore, if a candle of one of your Shabbat candles falls down on the carpet, on the table, and it didn't catch fire to anything else, and your choice now is to put out the candle or to pick it up and put it back on its place. In such a case, it's better to pick up the candle and put it back on its place, because moving the candle is only muktzeh, is only rabbinic, whereas putting it out could be a Torah prohibition. And therefore, once you're allowed to put out the fire, since it's dangerous to human life, you can handle this candle. You can either put it out or move it, and in such a case, it's better to just pick it up and put it back onto the candle holder. If you have a pet or any animal that is suffering, you are allowed to ask a non-Jew to perform even a Torah prohibition. This is called tsar ba'alei hayim. When an animal is suffering, we are obligated to save it from suffering, and therefore we are allowed to ask a non-Jew to help it. Whether it is to go and get food for it, whether it is to cook food for it, whether it is to administer medicine, to buy medicine, to save it from a dangerous situation, we can ask a non-Jew to help the animal that is suffering. And by the way, we are not supposed to feed animals on a street on Shabbat. Only if they are your pets and they depend on you, then you're allowed to feed them. However, if you know that animals are suffering, then you're allowed to feed them. Even wild animals and birds outside, you can feed if they're suffering. For example, in the winter, when the ground is covered with snow, the lakes are covered with ice, and the geese and other animals don't have food and they're starving, you are allowed to feed them. But on a regular Shabbat, when there is food for them in nature, you're not supposed to feed wild animals or birds. Now, not only we're not allowed to tell a non-Jew to do something for us on Shabbat, we cannot even hire them before Shabbat to do work for us on Shabbat. Whether it's for pay or for free, we cannot tell them before Shabbat to do something for us on Shabbat, and we cannot speak to them on Shabbat about hiring them for weekdays. For example, if you see a neighbor who is a non-Jew on Shabbat, you cannot tell him, can you please come to me on Sunday or Monday? I have a job for you. You cannot say that on Shabbat. Not only that, you cannot even hint to them on a weekday to do something on Shabbat. For example, you cannot tell a non-Jew, your neighbor, why didn't you turn the light on for my front porch last Shabbat? Here you're hinting to him that he should have come over, and he sees your front of the house is dark, he should have turned the light on, and you're rebuking him for it. You're not telling him, do it for me next Shabbat. You're just telling him, why didn't you do it last Shabbat? And that is prohibited. You're hinting to him that he should do work for you next Shabbat. And that is not allowed. Now, when we hire a non-Jew to do work for us, there are two ways we can do it. Either we pay them hourly or daily. That is called a hired worker. And that is always forbidden to hire such workers for Shabbat. There's one more kind of worker, and that is called contractor, where we don't pay per hour or per day, but rather we pay per job. And we give them some time, and as long as they finish this job, by that time they get this set amount, flat fee. Contractors are more lenient on Shabbat, and that is because they have a choice to work on Shabbat or to work on a weekday. We give them enough time. We ask them to do something on Thursday, and we're going to pick it up on Monday. So if they want, they can do it on Thursday. If they want, they can do it on Friday. If they choose to do it on Shabbat, that's their own choice. And therefore, they're not doing it specifically for us on Shabbat. They're doing it just because it's convenient for them on Shabbat. An example of that is bringing your clothing to a laundromat to dry cleaners, where you bring it on a weekday and you pick it up a couple days later after Shabbat. That is permitted, even if you bring it on Friday, as long as there is enough time either before Shabbat or after Shabbat for them to do the job. And even if you know they're going to do it on Shabbat, they're doing it not because you are asking them, but rather it's convenient for them. However, if you bring it to them Friday right before Shabbat, and you tell them, I want to pick it up right after Havdalah, Motzei Shabbat, Saturday night, that is forbidden, because you are basically asking him to do this work on Shabbat. You're not leaving him any opportunity to do it any other time on a weekday. Similarly, with mailing a letter, since post office are basically contractors for us, there is a set price for a letter. You purchase a stamp, you pay a set amount, and the letter will be delivered in 2 or 3 days. Even if it's delivered on Shabbat, you didn't ask them to deliver it on Shabbat. You gave them enough time if they want to fly before or after Shabbat, that is permitted. Similarly with packages, we're allowed to send the package on Friday for it to be delivered on Sunday or Monday. However, if you want to send an overnight, you give it to them right before Friday sunset, right before Shabbat, and you ask them that it should be delivered Shabbat morning, that is a problem, because you're asking them directly to do work for you on Shabbat. Similarly, you can drop your car by a mechanic who is a non-Jew, and all his workers are not Jewish, and ask them to fix it, and you'll pick it up on Sunday or Monday. Since potentially they can start working on it right away on Friday and fix it before Shabbat, or they can start working on it Motzei Shabbat and work throughout the night, or they can work on it Sunday morning, that's permissible. Even if they are going to work on it on Shabbat, that is still okay, because you're not asking them to do it on Shabbat. The prohibited exception for a contractor is if they're doing work on real estate, on land or on houses. Anything attached to the ground, you cannot allow a non-Jew to do work for you, even if he is a contractor, even if it's on his schedule and he wants to do it on Shabbat for himself. Since people will see him on your property doing work, and they will know that this is your property, they will assume that you hired him for the day or by hour. The only time that it is permitted is if that particular property is in a non-Jewish neighborhood and it's not within walking distance of any Jewish community, where no Jew will ever see this worker working on Shabbat. Then if the worker is a contractor and he wants to work on Shabbat, you don't have to stop him. However, under normal circumstances, for your personal house, it should not have any work done on it, even by a non-Jewish contractor, on Shabbat. Another example is landscaping. Since it's your property, your lawn, your backyard, they should not come on Shabbat. And by the way, if the entire house was built with the non-Jewish workers working on Shabbat as well as weekdays, you should not live in such a house. If a Jew built such a house for himself, he's not supposed to live in it. He should rather sell it, so that he doesn't benefit directly from the work that the non-Jew did on Shabbat. We mentioned that if a non-Jew does something for you voluntarily, he does it without you asking, you're not supposed to derive benefit from it. For example, you're sitting in a dark room and a non-Jew comes and says, "Let me help you." You're sitting in the dark and he turns the light on. you can continue sitting. However, you cannot do anything that you couldn't do until now. For example, if it was so dark that you couldn't read, you can sit there, you can drink a cup of tea, you can have a conversation with your friend. However, you cannot take out a book and read, because until now you were not able to do it, and by taking out book and reading, you're benefiting from the work that the non-Jew did. However, if until now you were able to read with difficulty, there was a little bit light from another room, from the outside, and you could read, but now the light that the non-Jew turned on makes it easier. In such a case, you can stay and read, since you're not only using the forbidden light that the non-Jew turned on, but you're also using permissible light that was there at the beginning. Even though now it's easier, it is nevertheless permitted if he did it by himself. However, if a non-Jew does something for us where we do not derive benefit directly, but rather from the fact that he removed the active influence, that is permitted. What's an example of that? If you're sitting in a room and the light is on and it's time to sleep, and the non-Jew comes in and says, oh, it's so late, you're probably tired, let me turn the light off. And he turns the light off. Can you sleep in that room now? And the answer is yes. Since darkness is not direct influence of his action, but rather it's the fact that there is no more light. His action turned the light in the past, and we no longer see the active influence of his action. As opposed to him turning the light on, the light is actively working every second because he turned it on. So where he turns the light off, we're allowed to benefit from the darkness. Where he turns the light on, we're only allowed to benefit from the light if we could do whatever we want to do now, even without that light. And therefore, if you have children or sick people, or even for yourself, it's hard to fall asleep with the light on, you can hint to a non-Jew, say, I forgot to turn the light off in my room, now the light is on, and it's hard for me to fall asleep. Just as a statement. And he will understand that he should turn the light off. In such a case, you're allowed to hint to the non-Jew, he will turn the light off, and you can sleep. Similarly, if you have an alarm that's ringing and it's bothering you, you can hint to a non-Jew that the alarm is on and it's bothering me. And the non-Jew will get the message, he will come and turn off the alarm. That's permitted because he's just removing the active influence, and you only benefiting from the fact that something is not there. Similarly, if you forgot to take out a light bulb in your refrigerator, you can ask a non-Jew to hint to him to remove the light. How do you hint? You say, oh, I forgot to take out a light bulb from my refrigerator. If I open the door, the light will go on, and I'm not allowed to open the door now. And you can tell him, can you please help me to take food out? He will come, he will take the food out for you, or open the refrigerator, say thank you, and now if you leave, I will not be able to close because the light is on. And he'll say, so what should I do? What do you want me to do? You can't tell him take the light out, but you can tell him, usually I take out the light before Shabbat, and this Friday I forgot. Now the only way I would be able to take food, to open the refrigerator, take out the food, is if there is no light there. And he'll get the message, he will take out the light bulb. However, there is no problem telling him directly, can you please open the refrigerator and give me food? Because you're not asking him to turn the light on. He is opening the door. Opening the door is permitted. There is a light switch that's connected to the door, and the light will go on. That happens automatically when he opens the door. We are not allowed to do that. But we are allowed to ask a non-Jew to do a permitted action, even if we know that automatically a forbidden action is going to happen. So if you have a live-in, you have a maid, you have a nanny who is not Jewish, and they're available, you can ask them as many times as you want on Shabbat, can you please open the refrigerator? I need to take food out. Can you please close the refrigerator? That is permitted. However, if you don't have ready access to a non-Jew, then you just call them once and you hint to them to take out the light bulb. If a non-Jew does something for himself, the Jew is allowed to benefit afterwards. For example, the non-Jew came to a dark room and turned the light on for himself because he wanted to see something. Then when he leaves, the Jew can come into the room and benefit from the light. The non-Jew opened the hot water faucet. The Jew can come and wash his hands afterwards. And therefore, you can use a trick if you want a light to be turned on in a certain room. You can ask a non-Jew, I left something in that room. Can you please go bring it to me? He will go to the dark room, and since he cannot see, he'll turn the light on. And he'll go in looking for the object, and then you just come in as well and stand in front of the light switch. And when he gives you the object, you say thank you, and you escort him out. Now, when he turned the light on in the room, it was for himself, so that it's easier to find the object. Now that he left, you can benefit from the light, because he didn't turn it on for you, he turned it on for himself. Similarly, if you ask your maid to wash dishes, and she chooses to turn the hot water on, she's turning it on for herself, for comfort of her own hands. Therefore, your dishes can be washed with hot water, that's okay. And if the water is still running, you can use that hot water as well, because she turned it on for herself. You can also ask a non-Jewish cleaning lady to sweep your house, to wash your dishes, and even to wash your floors if you explain to them how to do it correctly. The correct way to wash floors is to sprinkle some water on the floor and then wipe it. Not to soak a rag and squeeze it, but rather use a dry rag and sprinkle some water on the ground. You explain to her how to do it, and if she chooses to do it the way that it's easier for her, just to put it in a pail of water and squeeze it, she's doing it for her own comfort. You gave her a way to do it in a permissible way. Now, we will go through a couple of actual melachot. There are 39 melachot that we cannot do on Shabbat, 39 forbidden actions, forbidden labors. And each one has subcategories. For example, building has subcategories: banging the nail, drilling a hole, attaching two bricks together, cutting a piece of wood, screwing something in. All these are subcategories of building. So too, every one of the 39 categories of forbidden labor has many subcategories. So today we're going to speak about two of them. One is salting, preserving food. This is the subcategory of processing hides. When you shecht an animal, you skin it, then you have to process this skin that it shouldn't spoil, that it should be strong, durable. And the way they did it, they would soak it in a vat of special chemicals. Similarly, it is forbidden for us to pickle fruits and vegetables, to preserve them in salt or in vinegar. For two reasons. One is that it is similar to the melacha of processing the hide, using chemicals to change the quality of an object. And second is because when we pickle a vegetable, it's usually not for that day of Shabbat, but for a few days from then. So we're not allowed to do it because it's preparation from Shabbat to weekday. For example, we are allowed to put sugar on our food as opposed to salt. Since salt and vinegar are similar to processing the hides, that is forbidden. However, sprinkling sugar over strawberries, for example, is permitted. However, if your intent is to put sugar in order to preserve it for the next few days, that becomes forbidden. Similarly, if I want to sprinkle salt on my meat or my fish because I want to eat them now, that's permitted. However, if my intent is to preserve the meat or fish for future, that is not allowed. Now, what are the rules of salting food on Shabbat? We're not allowed to put vegetables that are usually pickled into brine on Shabbat, and vegetables that are not usually pickled we cannot put into brine on Shabbat, even if our intent is to actually pickle them. The vegetables that we usually pickle, like cucumbers, tomatoes, and so on, we cannot put them into the brine, even if our intent is just to give them some taste for now. I want to eat it now. My intent is not for future. Still, it's forbidden because it looks like processing leather. Fruits and vegetables that are not usually pickled, for example, cut tomatoes, watermelon, anything that when they're cut or peeled, we usually don't pickle them, lettuce, those things we are allowed to put into brine or sprinkle salt on them if our intent is to eat them right away. So whether it is putting in brine or sprinkling salt over vegetables or fruits is forbidden unless they are the kind of vegetables or fruits that are usually not pickled. And the two exceptions are peeled vegetables or sliced vegetables. We usually don't pickle them. So for example, if you want to make an Israeli salad, since the pieces are finely chopped, you're allowed to sprinkle salt on it. However, if you have whole cucumbers or grape tomatoes uncut, you're not allowed to sprinkle salt on a few pieces at a time. If you want to dip them in salt one at a time and eat, that's fine. If you want to dip them into salt, water, or brine or vinegar, that's fine. But you cannot do more than one. Sprinkle salt on more than one, or soak a few of them in brine. That's not allowed. Now, what is the way around it? to show that you're aware of this prohibition. And you do that by putting a little bit of oil on the salad or on these vegetables before you put salt. Because by putting oil on it, you show that I'm not interested that the salt should penetrate through. Because the oil forms a barrier and it's going to be harder for them to be pickled. So that shows that my intent is not for it to be pickled. So you're going to be safe if before salting any vegetable or fruit on Shabbat, you just sprinkle a little bit oil and then you can salt it. This only applies to fruits and vegetables and other food that is usually pickled. For example, raw fish or raw meat. However, if you have cooked fish, cooked meat, you can salt a few pieces at a time. Similarly, if you have hard-boiled eggs, you can salt all of them at the same time because we usually don't pickle eggs. We are also not allowed to make salt water solution. Since salt water solution, the brine, is usually used for pickling and pickling is not allowed, we cannot make the salt water. Therefore, if Pesach falls on Shabbat, you cannot prepare salt water for dipping the karpas. It has to be prepared before Shabbat. An interesting application of this is if you have half-sour pickles, which are pickles that are not fully pickled yet. You can open the jar, you can take out the pickle. Now you taste the pickle and you don't like the taste. It's not ready for you. Are you allowed to put it back into the jar? And you're not allowed to. Because by putting it back in, your intention is, I want it to continue pickling. I want the process to continue. So if you took out a half-sour pickle and it's not ready yet, just put it in a plastic bag, save it for after Shabbat, and after Shabbat you can put it into the jar. Now, going to the next melacha is coloring. Today we're only going to speak about coloring your food. Separately, we're going to speak about painting, coloring on paper or cloth. We Sephardim are lenient. We hold that there is no coloring prohibition of food or drink. And therefore, as long as my intent is not to produce a specific color, but rather just to mix two foods together or two liquids, I'm allowed to do it. For example, if I want to mix grape juice with water, for Ashkenazim they're strict. They say first pour the grape juice and then water. For Sephardim, it is preferable to put grape juice first and then water, but it's not obligatory. You're allowed to even to put water first and then add grape juice. Or if your child already comes with a cup with water, you don't have to spill it. You can add grape juice to it directly because your intent is just to dilute the grape juice, make it less sweet, and not to create specific color. Similarly, we are allowed to add spices to our food that produce color, like turmeric and paprika, that will make our food red or yellow. It is permissible on Shabbat because, again, there is no prohibition to color food on Shabbat. But again, your intention should not be that I want to color my food, I want my food to be specific color, just to add to the flavor, to the general look. And you have to keep in mind that if spices are not cooked or not roasted, you cannot put them onto hot food on Shabbat. Hot food either in the pot that it was cooked in or in a kli sheni. But if you poured it into, let's say you poured your soup or savo, cholent, into the serving bowl, and then from the serving bowl you poured it into your plate, now you can add pepper, you can add paprika, you can add any other spice, because in the kli shlishi, everything is already permitted. We will learn about the laws of cooking on Shabbat in next classes. Salt, in the United States, most white table salt is already cooked. The way they do it is they pump hot boiling water into the well underground. The water, hot water, melts all the salt, dissolves all the salt, and then they pump that salt water out and they evaporate the water, and they are left with the salt. So since hot boiling water is applied to the salt first, it's considered cooked. And therefore most white salt on the market today is cooked, and you can add it to kli rishon of the fire, which means if I take my osh savo off the fire, I take my chicken soup off the fire, and I taste it, it's not salty enough, I can add salt to it and mix it. And certainly you can add it to your plate. However, if you have salt that is not cooked, for example, Himalayan salt or sea salt that you know was manufactured by just gathering sea salt on a shore in a special pool and evaporating the water naturally with sunlight, such salt is considered not cooked, and therefore you should only add it to your own plate, not to kli rishon, not to the pot. And of course, we're not allowed to add anything onto the pot that is on fire or on the blech, because that actually looks like cooking. Even if the food is already cooked, but by adding into the pot and mixing, it looks like we are adding a new ingredient and we're mixing. And one more halacha about coloring. If your hands become dirty with beet juice or pomegranate juice, don't wipe it on a cloth or a towel. Rather rinse it first, or wipe your hands on a paper napkin that you can throw out. In the next 4 classes, we will go through majority of melachot, only the practical ones, including cooking, including separating borer, cutting to size, and so on. Shavua tov, ketivach v'chatima tova, shana tova u'mituka.